There is something I need to tell you that has been weighing on me for a long time, and I want to get it right because I almost did not share it at all. In 2019, the Pew Research Center published a survey that found 69% of Catholics in the United States believed the bread and wine at Mass are merely symbolic, not the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Just symbols. 69%. That is not a fringe group. That is more than 2 out of every 3 Catholics sitting in those pews every Sunday. And when I first read that number, I remember sitting at my kitchen table in Covington and thinking, that explains everything I have been watching for 35 years. The Vatican itself, in a document called Redemptionis Sacramentum, issued by the Congregation for Divine Worship in 2004, does not describe the behaviors we are going to discuss today as mere etiquette failures. It calls certain irreverent actions at mass grave abuses, its words, not mine, actions that threaten the dignity of the Eucharist and open the door to profanation. Not impoliteness. Profanation. Today I am going to show you exactly what is happening in those pews. I am going to rank the most common forms of irreverence at Mass from the least grave to the most spiritually significant. And I am going to show you what each one actually signals. Not according to my opinion, but according to the Church's own teaching, the testimony of saints, and a tradition going back to the earliest centuries of Christianity that almost nobody talks about anymore. Because here is the thing nobody told you, and it is the reason this matters more than you think. The Mass is not a performance observed by a human audience. And the moment you understand who is actually in that room with you, the phone on your lap, and the whispered conversation, and the missing genuflection start to look completely different. If you have never heard this explained, not as a lecture on manners, but as a real spiritual event with real unseen witnesses, then stay with me. Because by the end of this video, I want you to walk out of Sunday Mass differently than you walked in. Before I begin, if this is the kind of content that helps you, leave a like and subscribe to this channel. That tells YouTube this material has value, and it helps this channel reach people who are genuinely searching for what the Church actually teaches. Not what a summary says she teaches. It means a great deal. Now, let's begin. The disrespect in the pews does not come from malice. That is the first thing I need you to understand. And the reason this is harder to talk about than people think. Most of the people checking their phones during the consecration are not doing it out of contempt. Most of the people chatting in the narthex before Mass, as if they are at a reunion, are not trying to be irreverent. Most of the people who walk in 15 minutes late, take communion, and leave during the final blessing do not see themselves as doing anything wrong. And that is precisely the problem. Because when belief erodes before behavior does, the behavior does not look like sin from the inside. It just looks like normal. And normal is the most dangerous spiritual state you can be in when you are standing in the same room as the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. And you no longer fully believe that is what is happening. I want to start with a scene I have not been able to forget. It was the fall of 2018. I was at a conference in Cincinnati given by Father Chad Ripperger, a theologian and exorcist I had only heard about through other priests. He was speaking about the demonic in the modern age, and I had gone mostly out of intellectual curiosity. I had spent 3 decades teaching sacramental theology. I thought I knew what spiritual warfare meant. That afternoon, Father Ripperger quoted St. John Vianney directly. The Curé of Ars, the man whose confessional people traveled 3 days on foot to reach. Vianney recounted a vision he received. A demon walking the length of the pews during Mass, carrying a book, recording every sin and every distraction of those present, every whispered conversation, every wandering thought, every moment of inattention during the consecration. The demon did not need to tempt anyone during that Mass. He just needed to collect what was already being handed to him. I had been a Catholic my whole life. I had taught theology for 35 years, and that image stopped something in me. Not because I had never heard of demonic activity at the liturgy, but because for the first time I understood what it meant to say the Mass is a battlefield. Not a metaphor for struggle, but an actual contested event with actual witnesses on both sides of the veil. Stay with me here, because this is where it matters. The tradition that angels are present at every Mass is not a devotional nicety. It is a theological claim with patristic roots going back to the earliest centuries of the Church. The National Catholic Register and the Adoremus Bulletin have both documented this tradition extensively. The Mass is understood in Catholic theology as a participation in the heavenly liturgy itself, not a parallel service that runs alongside heaven, but an entry point into it. When a priest elevates the host at the consecration, the tradition holds that the angels gathered at that altar bow, not metaphorically, bow. And if that is true, and I believe it is, not because I feel it, but because the Church has taught it continuously since the patristic era, then what happens in those pews is not a question of personal preference or generational difference. It is a question of what you are doing in the presence of those witnesses. Now here is where it gets uncomfortable, because what I am about to describe is not a hierarchy of sins. It is a hierarchy of signals. Each of these behaviors, from the most common to the most grave, is transmitting something about what you believe, about who you think is in that room, about what you think is happening on that altar. And the guardian angels, yours and the ones gathered at that altar, are not unaware of what is being transmitted. Let me walk you through them. The first and most common form of disrespect in the pews is the one most people would not even recognize as disrespect: noise before Mass. Talking. Not quiet conversation with a family member about where everyone is sitting. Real talking, laughter, catching up, telling someone about your week. The kind of conversation that would be perfectly appropriate in any social space. Except that you are sitting in a room where the Blessed Sacrament is reserved in the tabernacle, sometimes fewer than 30 feet away. The EWTN pastoral letter on reverence for the Eucharist is clear on this point. Reverential silence is expected in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament, not because the rules say so, but because the Blessed Sacrament is actually present. Jesus Christ is literally in that room before the Mass even begins. Think about what that means for a moment. If you knew, with 100% certainty, that the President of the United States was sitting in a chair 15 feet from you, waiting for a formal ceremony to begin, you would not be carrying on a loud conversation with the person next to you about your weekend plans. You would lower your voice instinctively. You would be aware of the gravity of the space. The question the pre-Mass noise forces us to ask is a simple one. What does it mean that most people walk into a Catholic church where the body of Christ is physically present and feel no instinct toward quiet at all? It means, and the Pew Research data from 2019 confirms this, that the body is present in the building, but the belief is not. When 69% of Catholics describe the Eucharist as symbolic, the noise before Mass is not rudeness. It is the natural sound of a social gathering, because that is how the space is being processed by the people in it. The signal being transmitted is not malice. It is the absence of faith in the real presence. And the guardian angel standing next to every person in that room knows exactly what that absence means. The second behavior is the one that generates the most frustration among practicing Catholics today. Phones during Mass. A bright screen lighting up in your peripheral vision during the homily. The glow in the dim church as someone checks a notification during the consecration. The phone propped up in the pew to follow the readings on an app. And then the same phone used to check a message the moment the phone is already in hand. I want to be precise here because nuance matters. Using a phone to follow along with a missal app, the text of the Mass, the readings, the prayers, is not inherently irreverent. The problem is not the object. The problem is what the object becomes when belief is absent, and the habit of attention is already broken. Because here is what a phone during Mass actually communicates to every person around you, including the ones whose interior focus you are breaking simply by existing in their field of vision with a screen in your hand. You have something else competing for your attention. And you have not already decided that nothing in this room is more important than that other thing. 40 years ago, a priest who felt a phone ring during Mass would stop. He would let the silence expand until everyone in that room felt the weight of what had just been interrupted. Some priests still do this. The silence does its own work. The reason the phone is particularly significant spiritually is not the distraction it causes to others, though that is real, and the Church addresses it directly. The reason it matters is what it says about the internal hierarchy of the person holding it. If you are at Mass, and your first reflex when you feel a vibration is to look, not to silence the phone without looking, but to look, then something has already decided for you what is most important in that room. And it was not the consecration. Here I want to say something that I think is important, because I spent 35 years watching teenagers in classrooms, and I know the difference between rebellion and never having been taught. Most of the people doing this were never shown what the Mass actually is. They were told it is important. They were told to attend. They were given rules about when to sit and stand and kneel. They were not shown, viscerally, in a way that reached down below the intellect, that they were entering a room where something had been happening since the upper room, where angels gather, where the veil between time and eternity is thinner than anywhere else on earth. You cannot expect someone to treat a space with reverence that they have not been taught to see. And that is one of the failures I carry personally, because I taught that curriculum for 35 years, and I taught the rules. I did not always teach the reality behind the rules. Now here is where it gets difficult, because the behaviors I have described so far, the noise, the phones, the late arrivals, are in a category of their own compared to what I am going to discuss next. The third behavior is one that most people would not even think to put on a list of irreverences, because it looks, from the outside, like extra devotion. The extended hands during the Our Father. Lay people adopting the orans posture, hands extended, palms up, raised at the sides, during the Our Father. This gesture is the liturgical posture of the celebrant. It belongs to the priest, acting in persona Christi at the altar. The Congregation for Divine Worship addressed this directly. The orans posture during the Our Father is not prescribed for the laity in the Roman Rite. It is not forbidden everywhere in the same way, and there is legitimate discussion among liturgists about it. But the point is not the legality. The point is the signal. When a gesture that belongs to the one offering the sacrifice is adopted by the congregation as a spontaneous emotional expression, particularly one that has spread largely through a misunderstanding of what the priest is doing when he raises his hands, it reveals something about how the Mass has come to be understood. Not as a hierarchical act where the priest offers and the people unite their sacrifice to his, but as a community gathering where everyone expresses themselves in the same way, where the distinctions between the ordained priesthood and the baptismal priesthood have softened to the point of invisibility. I am not saying the people who do this are wrong to want to participate. I am saying that the desire to participate is real and good, and that it has been channeled into a gesture that subtly communicates something the Church does not teach. That the Mass is primarily about the community's self-expression rather than the offering of Christ's sacrifice through an ordained priest. The difference matters, and the fact that it has become common is not evidence that it is correct. It is evidence of how thoroughly the catechetical failure of the past 60 years has reshaped what ordinary Catholics believe the Mass to be. Remember what I said about belief eroding before behavior does. This is a perfect example. The gesture is not hostile. It is sincere, and it signals a theology of the Mass that is, in the technical sense, incomplete. Now, here is where the tradition about the angels becomes concrete in a way I want you to hold on to. The patristic tradition, the writing of the early Church Fathers, consistently describes the Mass as a participation in the heavenly liturgy, not a rehearsal for it, not a symbol of it, a participation in the same eternal act of worship that occurs before the throne of God. The Fathers describe the angels as gathered at the altar, present in a real though invisible way, their worship joined to the worship of the faithful. St. John Vianney's vision of the demon with the book was not an anomaly. It was the dark side of the same reality, that the Mass is a contested event, observed by beings who are not limited by time or space, who understand exactly what is happening on that altar in a way that no human being in the nave fully does. And when the nave is full of noise, screens, late arrivals, and gestures borrowed from a role that does not belong to the congregation, the signal being sent to every observer, human and non-human, is the same. We are not sure this is what the Church says it is. That is the spiritual cost of casual irreverence, not the offense to etiquette, the signal about belief. Now I need to tell you about the most grave form of disrespect in the pews, and it is the one that almost never makes these lists because it is invisible. The fourth irreverence is receiving communion in a state of mortal sin. I want to be careful here, because I am not describing anyone specific. I am describing a phenomenon that the Church has addressed in her formal documents as a genuine crisis. 1 Corinthians 11, verses 27 through 29. St. Paul warns that whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord unworthily will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. And he adds something that should stop us cold. Whoever eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. The Church teaches that anyone in mortal sin who receives communion without a prior sacramental confession commits a sacrilege. That word, sacrilege, is the Church's word, not a rhetorical escalation. The Catechism uses it directly. This is not a matter of visible behavior. You cannot see it from the adjacent pew, but it is the most profound form of disrespect the pews contain, because it is the one that most directly involves the real presence, the consecrated host, and the state of the soul receiving it. Here is the account that has stayed with me since I read it in preparation for this video. There is a recurring pattern reported by priests, widely documented in pastoral writing on the liturgy, that when a significant disruption occurs during Mass, some priests have responded not with spoken correction, but with deliberate silence. They stop. They let the silence expand, and they let the congregation feel, in the weight of that silence, the magnitude of what was just interrupted. That silence is the priest's way of saying, you may not have understood what was happening before you broke it. Now you do. The same silence, in a sense, is what St. John Vianney was describing when he spoke of the demon with the book. The recording of what is being handed over freely during the Mass. Every moment of inattention, every choice to look at the phone, every communion received without discernment, is not a punishment from a distant God. It is a spiritual reality observed by beings who understand the Mass better than most of us in the pews do, and the guardian angel standing next to you at Mass, your guardian angel, the one assigned to you specifically, is not indifferent to what happens in that hour. I did not always think of it this way. For most of my teaching career, I described guardian angels the way the textbooks described them, as spiritual companions, protectors against physical harm, guides through difficult moments. Useful, comforting, somewhat abstract. Then, about 2 years after Margaret died, I was at a daily Mass at my parish here in Covington. A Tuesday morning, almost no one in the pews, the light coming through the east window the way it does in winter. And the priest was saying the words of consecration, and something shifted in how I was attending to what was happening in that room. Not an experience, not a vision, just a recognition. that this room was full. Not of people. The building was nearly empty, but the tradition I had been reading for 4 years, the patristic accounts, Padre Pio's letters about the angels present at every Mass, the liturgical theology of the heavenly worship, was not abstract in that moment. It was the frame through which I was seeing an ordinary Tuesday morning liturgy in northern Kentucky, and I thought about all the Masses I had attended in 35 years where I had done the equivalent of walking into that room and opening my newspaper, not out of contempt, out of habit, out of a belief that had quietly calcified into routine without my noticing. The disrespect in the pews does not usually come from people who have rejected the faith. It comes from people who have kept the practice, while the belief underneath it has slowly, almost imperceptibly, drained away. And the Church has been sounding that alarm for decades. If you have arrived at this point in the video, you are already in a smaller group than you might realize. Most people who click on a title like this one are looking for confirmation of their frustration. They want someone to agree that the people around them at Mass are doing something wrong. And some of that frustration is legitimate. The behaviors I have described are real. The spiritual significance I have described is documented by the Church herself, not invented for a video. But if you have stayed this long, you have probably also heard something else, a different kind of question underneath the one you came in with. Not just, why don't they respect the Mass? But, what does my own presence at Mass actually look like to those unseen witnesses? That is the harder question, and it is the right one. Here is what the Church's own document says. Redemptionis Sacramentum, the Vatican instruction from 2004. The celebration of the Mass must be carried out with the greatest reverence to protect it from profanation and to safeguard the dignity of the Eucharist. That instruction was not issued to scold a generation. It was issued because the Congregation for Divine Worship understood that the problem was systemic. Not individual bad actors, but a widespread erosion of belief in what the Mass is, expressed through behaviors that once would have been unthinkable. 69% of American Catholics describing the Eucharist as symbolic is not a statistic about the people in the pews. It is a statistic about what those people were taught, or more precisely, what they were not taught. For the past several generations, the theology of the real presence was not hidden. It was not suppressed. It was taught. But it was taught, in many cases, as a fact to be accepted rather than a reality to be inhabited. And facts without formation produce exactly what we see on Sunday mornings: compliance without conviction, presence without attention, the form of worship without the substance of belief. The angels at the altar are not frustrated by this. Frustration is a human response. But the tradition does say that angelic worship is offered in perfect proportion to the glory of what is happening on that altar, and that the worship offered by the faithful, when it is offered rightly, joins that angelic worship in a way that nothing else in human experience can replicate. That is what is available to you at every Mass you attend. Not a community gathering, not a ritual obligation. An entry point into the heavenly liturgy itself, attended by beings whose understanding of what is happening there makes your most reverent moment seem like a rough draft. That is what a phone in your hand is competing with. That is what the noise before Mass is drowning out. That is what receiving communion without discernment is handling as if it were ordinary. Now here is something Padre Pio said that I want to leave you with, because it has shaped how I think about this more than almost anything else I have read. Padre Pio attended Mass daily, celebrated Mass as the central act of his priesthood, and spoke of the Mass with an intensity that his brother friars sometimes found overwhelming. He said, and I am quoting from his letters, which I have read in their original Italian and in multiple reliable translations, that if we could see what happens at Mass, we would die, not from fear, from the weight of the reality. He was a man who bore the wounds of Christ in his own body, He was not given to exaggeration. He was not speaking rhetorically. He was saying, "You are not capable, as a human being in a body, of perceiving the full reality of what is occurring at every Mass. The veil is thin, but it is still there. And behind it, around the altar, in the nave, in every corner of that church, is a level of activity, of attention, of worship, that your ordinary senses cannot access. Your guardian angel is not behind that veil. Your guardian angel is standing next to you. And your guardian angel, assigned to you specifically, aware of every thought you are thinking and every distraction pulling at your attention, is present for the full duration of every Mass you attend. What does that angel observe when you walk in? I want to be clear. I am not asking that question as a rebuke. I spent 35 years teaching theology and walked into Mass with an open newspaper's worth of distraction more times than I can count. I am asking it because it is the question that changed how I sat in those pews. And I think it might do the same for you. The reform that the Vatican was calling for in 2004 was not a reform of external behavior for its own sake. It was a reform of attention, of what we actually believe is happening when the priest elevates the host, of whether the belief we say we hold has made it all the way into the body. The bowed head, the quiet, the hands folded, the phone left in the car, because the body is the loudest signal in that room. Louder than anything you say. Louder than the intellectual assent you gave to the catechism. The angels watching are not reading your mind. They are watching what you do with your hands, your eyes, your phone, your voice, your knees. And the guardian angels, yours and the ones gathered at that altar, are weeping, the title of this video says. That word comes not from sentimentality, but from a tradition that understands what is being lost every Sunday in every parish where the majority of people in the pews would describe the Eucharist as a symbol. What is being lost is the participation, the union of the earthly liturgy with the heavenly one. The moment where the angel standing next to you bows in the same direction you are bowing, and the worship offered in that room reaches the throne of God as a single, unified act. Human and angelic, time and eternity, the nave and the altar and the heavenly court, all oriented toward the same reality. That is what reverence protects. And it is what irreverence, even casual, habitual, completely unintentional irreverence, gradually dissolves. Now I want to tell you about something that has helped me keep this in mind in a practical way, because I know that understanding something intellectually and actually changing a habit are two different challenges. 3 years ago, in the months after Margaret died, I was attending Mass almost every day, not out of extraordinary piety, but because I needed a place to bring something I had nowhere else to put. Grief does that. It strips away the automatic pilot and forces you to be present to whatever is in front of you. And in that season, for the first time in my adult life, I started arriving at Mass 10 minutes early. Not to review the readings, not to say the rosary in the pew, just to sit in the silence before the Mass began and let the space do what it does, which is to remind you, if you are paying attention, that you are not the only one in the room. I left my phone in the car. I know that sounds extreme for some people. It is not a rule I am imposing on anyone. It is what I needed to do to stop treating the liturgy like a social event I was attending while also remaining reachable. Those 10 minutes changed the quality of every Mass I attended in that period. Not because the Mass itself changed, because I changed what I brought into it. And if you have never tried arriving before the organ prelude and sitting quietly in that space, not performing reverence, just being present to what the tradition says is actually in that room, I would encourage you to try it once. Just once. You do not need to fix your posture, silence your phone, and arrive early all at the same moment. You do not need to correct anyone else. The reform I am describing is a private one. between you and the witnesses who are already there when you walk in. You do not need to change everything tonight. You only need to stop telling yourself that none of it matters. Because it does. The Church says so. The saints who saw behind the veil say so. And somewhere in the part of you that came to this video looking for something more than frustration, that part of you already knows it too. Take this with you tonight. That is what this channel exists to offer. Not rules, not performances of piety, but the reality that the textbooks left out. The Mass as Padre Pio knew it, as John Vianney witnessed it, as the earliest Christians described it to their converts. The holiest event on earth, attended by witnesses you cannot see, available to you every single week. Walk in differently next Sunday. See what happens. And because I know many of you watching this also carry people with you into that pew. People you have loved and lost. People whose names you whisper at the consecration. I want to tell you about something that I believe is one of the most powerful ways to honor that love. Padre Pio prayed for the souls in purgatory with a ferocity that surprised even those closest to him. He spoke of purgatory not as a theological abstraction, but as a place filled with real people, specific people known by name in heaven, undergoing a real process of purification before they could stand in the presence of God. He believed, and the Church teaches, that our prayers reach them, that the Mass offered for the dead actually accomplishes something for them. For those of you who want to make that intercession structured and sustained, there is a program built on exactly this tradition, Purgatory Rescue, a 30-day prayer campaign for souls in purgatory, built on Padre Pio's practice of intercession for the deceased. It is a structured program, 30 days, specific prayers, designed to help you intercede intentionally for the people you have lost, in the tradition that the Church has always taught and that Padre Pio practiced with extraordinary devotion. You can find it through the link in the description below. I want you to know that this is not a program I recommend lightly. 30 days is a real commitment. But if you have a Margaret, someone you lost whose soul you carry with you when you walk into that church, this is a way to turn that love into action in the form the tradition recognizes most clearly. The link is in the description. I will also have it in the pinned comment. If you stayed this long, you already understand something that 69% of the people in those pews have not yet been given the tools to understand. You know now what is happening on that altar. You know who is in that room. You know what the body language of the congregation is signaling. And you know what yours is capable of signaling instead. The only thing left to change is the Sunday morning habit. Not out of obligation. Out of the recognition that you have been invited into something that the angels themselves bow before. I will be here next time with more of what the textbooks left out. Thank you for being here. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had a moment at Mass? Not a vision, just a moment, where the weight of what was happening suddenly became real to you? I would genuinely like to know. That kind of experience is more common than people admit, and it does not always make it into conversations about faith.